Hi. I'm really glad to be here. And before I start, I really want to thank Professor Welch, who made this possible and who we have been corresponding for a while now. Before I was coming, then I was not coming. So I'm really grateful for all the time and effort for making this possible. I'm also really glad to be on this panel and yeah, not just starting right off. So my paper is on Arati Kadav's work, and I'm studying her presence in the Hindi film industry as a only female writer, director, producer. Arati Kadav's work got noticed in India after she was nominated for the Netflix-supported BAFTA Breakthrough India Talent, by which she got the mentorship of a year with the Hollywood director Colin Trevorrow. Trevorrow is the director of American indie sci-fi film Safety Not Guaranteed, as some of you would already know, as well as the Jurassic World films. The popular media discourse and articles written on her foray into science fiction as a woman writer, director, and producer. Uh, they basically describe her in a certain way, and which can be compared to being very similar to how earlier articles on and the popular media discourse was trying to co-opt the work of American India astronaut aerospace engineer Kalpana Chawla. So just for fun, I'm using that analogy. Much like Kalpana Chawla grew up in a small town close to the capital city of Delhi, India, actually Artika Dev also grew up in Nagpur, which is just a few miles away from the financial capital of India, Bombay. Trained as a computer science engineer from India, India's premier engineering college known as IIT, which is like maybe like the MIT, yeah, in US. Aarti left India to work in US as a software developer in Microsoft shortly after finishing her engineering. Just after a decade, Kadav returned to India, and this time she switched professions totally and moved to filmmaking. She says that it was a calling right from the start. She was a storyteller since a child, but India does have an obsession with more conventional science based, STEM based courses in the middle class, and I guess therefore she joined engineering. And after graduating in the last decade, Aarti has directed, produced, and written for four science fiction films, apart from her other work. In this essay, I'll be studying Kadav's presence as the only sci fi writer director working in India right now in a genre that hardly gets any attention or value from the audience or the Hindi film industry. So, the Hindi film industry chooses to focus on romance, drama, action, yeah, and largely all other genres, in at least in commercial cinema, are and box office releases almost hardly ever happen. These three genres rule the roost. Before I move on, I want to give you a very short introduction into the history of science fiction in India so that you know how little is done. And thereby, in comparison, you come to know how important Artikada's work is and how difficult the work would have been. Unlike Hollywood, the science fiction genre has consistently been on the margins of Hindi film industry. Nanabhai Bhatt's Mr. X in Bombay, a 1957 film, is considered to be the first Indian science fiction film, which follows a lab assistant who accidentally drinks an invisibility potion and thus becomes invisible. The first three decades, from almost from 57 to about 88 of the Indian science fiction cinema in the Hindi film industry, were largely making few and far between films that were focusing on similar stories and using formal devices of song and dance and melodrama. So what they were doing was song and dance and melodrama were largely the larger formal devices that are incomprehensible. I mean, a film can't be made without them, or box office commercial cinema. So all films had to be situated within that. And science fiction as a genre doesn't accommodate that very well. Yeah. So, but early science fiction films thus were constantly adapting to having songs and dances and a very heightened melodrama. So the two films which I've just the first film was Mr. X in Bombay, which largely was had a lot of that, and the second film, which was also a commercial film, was Chand Par Chadhai, meaning Attack on the Moon. It had a team of humans landing on the moon to fight warriors from other planets. Most of the early science fiction films, thus, were focusing on either invisibility or on dealing with aliens. Yeah. And this was the first 3 to 4 decades were largely about this and how to fit it within the song and dance and melodrama, which is largely how popular Indian cinema is formally devised. So it is towards the end of the 90s that we got somewhat found a franchise, only franchise, which mixed elements of supernatural with elements of superhero film and with a dash of science fiction, which was called Koi Mil Gaya. Koi Mil Gaya literally means I found someone. It is the story of an intellectually challenged young boy and an alien who's stranded on Earth. One of the only and most successful franchises of Hindi film industry, Koi Mil Gaya gave rise to a huge Indian science fiction superhero amalgamation genre. Lately, in the last decade, there have been successful attempts to reimagine and revise the Indian superhero genre, which have also got some very few elements of science fiction storytelling. The two reasons which are often quoted by industry experts for very limited exploration of the genre are A, technology, and B, the fact that the budgets which we the Hindi film industry has to compete with for a commercial release are Hollywood budgets, and those that kind of risk no producer is ready to take for a genre like science fiction. Also, we have to remember that today, in at least in the last 10 years, almost all Hollywood films are being dubbed into even the regional languages. So this competition is a real competition. All films, Indian films, are being compared to how science fiction is being done in Hollywood. Yeah, and there is no way any producer can compete with a budget like Avatar's budget. Yeah, and that's a real problem Indian producers are dealing with, and therefore they are not foraying into this genre at all, which is anyway seen as a risky genre. So now, I mean, this is the larger landscape and historical perspective, very short one, but due to paucity of time, that's all we have time for. So now I'm moving into what Arti Kadav is trying to do, some reflections. So, Arti Kadav's gaze, inventing the Indian science fiction film. So what I'm trying to say here is that largely Kadav's effort is to find a visual and formal and narrative language for devising a very Indian science fiction film. In this section, using two of her recent films, Cargo and The Astronaut and the Parrot, I argue that Kadav is trying to search for a visual language that embodies what can become a deeply Indian science fiction film slash genre. She is reimagining this genre using certain budget friendly formal devices and codes, and also a few Indian narrative devices and storytelling traditions. Her debut feature, Cargo, which was made in 2019, a science fiction drama exploring themes of life, death, reincarnation, is the first and only science fiction film from India to be acquired by Netflix and is available to view on the platform even today. The film has played at 27 film festivals around the world. Miami International Film Festival is one of them. Shanghai is the other one. She has also won the Asian New Talent Award. And of course, I told you about the BAFTA nomination. Cargo is set on a spaceship called Pushpak. Now, Pushpak actually is a bird from the Indian scriptures and mythology. I don't have time for going into details there. In which, so in the film, the spaceship itself is called Pushpak. She redevises the whole space as a very Indian space in which a well-known Indian actor. So I'm saying that a well-known Indian actor chose to act in it to show that, because most actors refuse risky genres, but she could manage that. In which a well-known Indian actor, Vikrant Masi, plays the demon Prahasta, who, with the help of a female astronaut, which is again played by Shweta Tripathi, a character actor, works for the post-death transition services. Post-death transition services is an enterprise which works to recycle and make dead people ready for a smooth and comfortable experience of rebirth through a four-stage procedure of first taking their belongings, then healing them from any ailments, then erasing their old memory of this birth, and finally extracting them into a new world. So the whole film shows that. So ideally, I would like to show a clip of Cargo here, but I guess we'll take that up hopefully towards the end if there's time. I have sent the clips to the organizers and they can show them to you. So I'll be moving on. So I'll be So now so largely what Aarti is trying to do is find through form and through certain storytelling devices which are very Indian, she's trying to experiment and find a Indian sci-fi film. Yeah, so the narrative devices that she's using to do so. Kadav builds her storytelling universe using elements of Indian mythology, scriptures, religion, epic narratives like Mahabharata and Ramayana, folk tales, and even elements of magic. For example, in Cargo, the narrative elements like Pushpak, the spaceship's name, the name of characters itself, which are taken from mythology, the presence of humans with tails, and their referencing with actual gods like Hanuman, the idea of rebirth, which is from the scriptures, the presence of birds like the pigeon and the parrots, which again have very deep relevance in Indian mythology, and the idea of taking the idea of Rakshasa. Rakshasa is like a mythological concept which goes back to the epics of India and bringing them to this century and then redevising a plot around them, which is about a peace treaty between the demons and the humans. Similarly, in the Astronaut and the Parrot, spatio-temporal separation between Earth and the space is disrupted when the only person who can hear the messages of a lost in space engineer named Ali, whose crew has just died in a blast, is a parrot sitting on Earth. Now, so what happens in Astronaut and the Parrot is that due to a mishap in space, space engineer is detethered from the spaceship and he's about to die. His oxygen is depleting. Now it's about a 15 to 20-minute film in which he's trying to communicate with his daughter, yeah, because he has made some promises, and it's this and the only person he can communicate with somehow is this parrot sitting in an astrologer's shop in a Hindu temple in a city of Dwarka. Now Dwarka again is a very is a space which has some religious Hindu ancient connotations. Yeah, so all of those have are layers which she's trying to make through both films. So Ali can only talk to the parrot. Parrot's name is Manohar and is being tutored by Ali, who's about to die, to give a message somehow of a dying father, that is the space engineer, to his little daughter back on Earth. And the message says that I will now live close to the moon and I'll always love her. In Indian mythology, the parrot is a bird that symbolizes the vehicle for the god of love. And Aarti situates these very Indian narrative elements into narrative structures and tropes borrowed from Hollywood, high budget films like Interstellar, Gravity. Now, if you'll notice, this is a story. The Astronaut and the Parrot is a story very similar to Gravity, yeah? And so she's taking that trope, but she's using narrative elements and narrative structure, which is very Indian. Uh, these well-known tropes of Hollywood's high-budget films are reinvented by Aarti, and she's also in a constant dialogue with today's socio-political events. So her films are not really creating a separate universe outside Indian contemporary realities, which itself shows that she's trying to experiment and see what will an Indian sci-fi film look like. Yeah. So Kadav's films make very layered comments and notes on gender discrimination, on gender violence, on class conflict in India, on religious fundamentalism and fanaticism. All these tales are on secularism. Especially, these are very important ideas and themes for India right now because we are in a time where religious fundamentalism and the far Hindu right we are seeing it play out, yeah, since the last 15 years. The Indian formal and narrative elements are often used in conjunction with the history of American science fiction to devise a very Indian science fiction narrative. She's almost writing the language for it and designing the codes and signs for it, which not only move away from narrative legacy of high budget Hollywood film, and but also try to create the possibility of a much lower budget but slick and situated in reality Indian science fiction film. Thereby, she creates a new aesthetic in which her cinema simulates and creates using elements of analog, digital, and her fantastic imagination of what would be a spaceship. Now, analog plays a very important part in Arti's work. So, if you'll see, mixes, she constantly recontextualizes what analog can do. So, even in the astronaut and the pilot, the messages are being caught by this very old radio in the temple, yeah, which are being heard by the parrot. Yeah, so the frequency is so that's how she matches the frequency. Similarly, in cargo, we constantly see these old analog black and white television being used to on the spaceship itself. Yeah, so analog. Now, why is analog being simulated again and again in new ways work? Because a, it gives it a DIY feel. Also, India is a country which is still very much living in analog in its villages and small towns. It's not digitalized. And I think it referencing analog is a very important and significant part of her creating the Indian sci-fi film. She rejects the trappings of high budget Hollywood production, and also, as she does that, she re strategizes and reinvents the language for the science fiction film itself. The film seeks inspiration from Indian mythological tales as well as folklore, even if stylistically it might look similar to Hollywood films. So I have about 3.5 minutes left. So I will be talking about her formal devices. So apart from using um analog and digital and what the imagined future of spaceship and AI, uh, apart from mixing all of this, Arati also constantly uses a very DIY feel. There is a very DIY feel to her films. All the films are very low budget. You get even in the astronaut and the pilot, although it's almost slick, but you do come to know that the lost astronaut and the light on him is being created by a lens flare. Yeah, and I don't think there is much attempt to hide that. At the same time, it still works because the storytelling and the elements in the storytelling are so contextualized, and the storytelling itself is so specific to the context in which it is being told. I think Aarti, to conclude, thus, I think Aarti's work largely at the moment is not only talking about her gaze is not only a gaze which is imagining a space which is talking about gender and class, but beyond that, and with that, she's also trying to as a writer director working in this space, she's also trying to imagine what nobody has been able to do, which is moving away from the popular idea of what a Indian film can do. She's trying to imagine a very Indian science fiction film, yeah, and with smaller budgets, which is India's reality, which does not have to compete thereby with the Hollywood budgets, and thus will perhaps navigate itself with its new aesthetic and new understanding of what an Indian science fiction film can do within the larger box office reality of India. And the net on while it is on Netflix, it's still doing quite well. Her film Cargo, and I guess if interested people here can check her work out. But I'll end here, and I guess we can take more questions. I have almost 2 minutes left, so I guess from I would like to show the clips that I have, and perhaps just introduce the PowerPoint. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm waiting the questions. Thanks again to Roseanne for making this possible. Thanks to my co-panelists, and thanks to the audience here. Thank you so much.